Hello everyone, welcome back to the Merit Shine Turbo series, and we are back with finance, and this lecture is going to specifically focus on derivatives. So I hope your preparations are going pretty strong, and this lecture is just going to help you add a bit more to your preparation and to your arsenal. So in this particular session, we're going to use a mix of past year questions that have appeared as far as derivatives are concerned, and also look at some fresh questions and use that combination to further develop and understand the concepts around derivatives. So that's how the questions will be used. You'll find that many of these questions might appear to be straightforward and simple, but we will use those questions to understand concepts. The other reason for using some of the previous year questions is to understand and gauge the level of difficulty as far as this particular topic is concerned, which is where it gives us a good indicator of how difficult or how easy those questions were. You'll find that if you understand the fundamentals correctly, a lot of these questions were fairly straightforward and easy. And that's what we're going to try and achieve today, wherein we try to clear our fundamentals, clear our concepts, so that a lot of these questions become easy for us to solve. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So let's kickstart the session with the first question for the day. Okay. What does it say? A derivative is basically a financial instrument to hedge risks. Okay, all of us know that. And it basically derives its value from, and a host of options have been given. Now, why do you see 8 options here? Because I've kind of merged 2 questions that have appeared in SEBI and RBI in different years, and basically combined that to give you all the options that were there, right? So when you look at the overall construct here, let's first of all understand what a derivative is, right? So derivative is nothing but an instrument which basically derives its value from something. So it follows the fundamental principles of calculus, wherein we say that you look at a d by dx of y. So this entire expression then becomes your derivative, and your y is basically the value from where the derivative's value is actually derived, right? So that's the context behind derivative. And obviously derivatives can be of various types and look at different classes of securities, right? And that's the context that derivatives deal with, right? So the flexibility is that obviously it allows you to hedge a lot of risks. At the same time, it also allows you to look at a greater amount of leverage, right? Which means that you're able to act on a lot of trades which otherwise might not have been possible in the normal situation. So that's the benefit of using derivatives as well, right? So when I talk about some of the types of derivatives that are there, so basically you talk about forwards, then you talk about your futures, and we'll discuss each one of these during the course of the session. Then we talk about swaps, and last but not the least, we talk about options. These are the fundamental derivatives that are there. Obviously, there are multiple variations that are also possible around them, right? So the whole point is that a derivative will not exist till the time there is something on whom its value depends, right? So unless there is a y that is changing, you will not have a derivative existing at all. So what is this y called? This y is basically known as the underlying instrument or the underlying security, right? So depending on the type of derivative, the underlying instrument could be different things. So for example, I talk about a forward, and it basically is in the context of, let's say, agriculture. Let's say, for example, we talk about a farmer A trying to sell mangoes to a corporate B, okay? But because of various reasons and the entire uncertainty around the price of mangoes and the seasonality of mangoes, he's unsure about the price that he might get for a harvest which is, let's say, due 3 months from now, right? So what the farmer tries to do in that stage is that he tries to get into a derivative contract, and basically it could either be a forward in the context of it being over the counter and not really being part of an exchange, or it could be a future which could probably be more regulated instrument, right? So under this case, because we're talking about a farmer and a very specific scenario, let's assume that he enters into a forward contract with the corporate B that, say, at the end of 3 months he will basically price each of those mangoes at rupees 1,000. Now the point is, why is this price being fixed? Because there is an uncertainty in what's going to happen to the price of mangoes 3 months down the line. That's the whole logic or the thought process behind it, right? And if, let's say, the mangoes are going to become costlier than 1,000 rupees 3 months down the line, then obviously the farmer will tend to lose, right? Because he would have already booked the amount in terms of 1,000, right? And if the price goes above 1,000, let's say 1,050 or whatever, that will technically be a loss for the farmer. But understand one thing, that farmer is not necessarily a trader, right? What is the farmer trying to do? Farmer is trying to hedge his risks of a variability in the price 3 months down the line as far as the mangoes are concerned. So what he does instead is gets into a derivative contract in the form of a forward, and in that scenario, if the price of the mango falls to, let's say, rupees 900, the farmer will be able to sell those mangoes because it's a predetermined price of 1000, right? That's the whole context behind a very simple layman's example of what a derivative is all about, right? Now, what are some of the fundamental things that are required as far as derivatives are concerned? So the first thing that you need is any derivative will require someone called as your counterparty, right? So there are two parties involved in any kind of a derivative contract, right? Obviously. And the second important aspect is there has to be some kind of a contractual agreement that needs to be there between these two parties, right? That's the second aspect. The third important aspect is that there has to be some kind of a market that could possibly be required or exist, right? So that in case this contract can be traded, then it obviously offers greater amount of liquidity for that contract, right? So as a result, when I talk about a market, many of the times, some of these standardized derivatives, when you talk about them, they basically can be traded over the exchanges, right? And the exchanges in turn provide the market that we're talking about, right? And the other very crucial aspect is that for a derivative contract to exist, you definitely need an asset which is a common requirement for both the counterparties, right? So that common asset in this case between, let's say, the farmer and the corporate was nothing but the mangoes, and there was a contract on top of the mangoes, right? So here the forward is basically the derivative and the mango is the underlying, and that is what is the principal common asset required in a derivative instrument, right? And that's why this one is basically the answer that we're looking for. So derivative is basically a financial instrument used to hedge risks, and it derives its value from the underlying, right? All the other options do not necessarily indicate the value that the derivative can derive from, so they do not fit into the context, right? So margin is something which we'll discuss in one of the future questions. So now the options fit into the context of what a derivative is. So this is what is the fundamental basic concept as far as derivatives is concerned. So the answer to this question is your underlying. Okay, so let's quickly move on to the next question for the day. What does it say? The price risk is basically the risk of a decline in the value of a security or a portfolio, right? So when we took up the layman's example in the previous case, it is nothing but the decline in the value of mangoes 3 months down the line. So that was the context. Now the question is, how can I transfer that kind of a price risk, right? So there are three fundamental ideas that are there as far as any transaction is concerned, right? So first is your arbitrage, second is your speculation, and third one is your hedging. What the farmer did in the previous example that we discussed was to protect his interests in terms of getting the best value for his produce, and the produce in this case was mangoes. So when you're trying to protect your interests and when you're trying to, let's say, cut down your risks or eliminate your losses, and in the process, if the future actually presents a positive scenario also, you're willing to let go of that positive outlay in terms of risk, then basically you're hedging. Now in the context of the farmer, what was happening? He was basically okay to get 1000 rupees. Now even if the price went to 1050, he was willing to forego that 50 because he's getting 1000. That is the whole idea. So I'm willing to forego this extra 50 that I might get in order to protect my base price that I'm looking for, right? So I'm trying to eliminate my risks, right? It may also limit my upside potential, as it is called in these terms. So upside means upar kitna jayega, right? So it basically limits my upside potential, but it significantly cuts down my downside risk, right? Kitna niche gir sakta hai, right? So even if it goes below 1000, the farmer will still be able to sell at 1000. That's the whole idea. And that, my friends, is basically known as hedging, right? Now, how is hedging different from speculation? What happens in speculation is basically you're saying that I'm a pure play trader. I don't really care about what happens to the mangoes. The price may go up or the price may go down. It's not affecting me as such. So what I do is that I'm just taking a bet. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a bet alone. So it's not just gambling, right? So it's about taking a bet, let's say, based on some kind of data that is available to me, some kind of information that is there, and some kind of an analysis that I may have done, basis which I'm saying that the price of mangoes will basically go up. Now, if I say that the price of mangoes 3 months down the line is expected to go up, automatically I will take a bullish position or a positive expectation, right? What's the opposite of bullish? Bearish. That's the context. So, if many of you would have seen Scam 1992, this is the context in which we talk bulls and bears. So, if there is a positive sentiment, it is bullish. If there is a negative sentiment, it is bearish. So, in that context, if I'm bullish about the value of mangoes exceeding 1,000, or let's say going higher than where they are right now, then automatically I will take a positive position in the market accordingly, expecting the price to go up, right? Now, when I do that, so I become a pure play speculator because I'm not directly dealing with the underlying instrument in any way, and I'm not doing this to hedge my risks. I'm basically taking positions in the market in the expectation that I will make a profit, right? So that doesn't mean that there's no chance of a loss. Obviously, there is every chance of a loss, and that is a risk that I'm willing to take, right? So there is definitely risk, but I'm purely speculating. I'm not trying to hedge my risks in any way. So that becomes a pure play speculation. When I talk about arbitrage, it is essentially talking about an opportunity that exists due to some kind of a differential between two different markets or two different scenarios. Now, what kind of an opportunity could it be? Let's say, for example, I'm talking about a company ABC, and its stock is basically trading on the New York Stock Exchange, right? And let's say that that particular stock is basically trading at $20 on the New York Stock Exchange. But let's say at the same moment, the stock of the company ABC is also trading at the London Stock Exchange, but at a price differential of 20.05. So what happens in this case is that the trader can basically buy the stock of ABC on New York Stock Exchange and basically sell it on the London Stock Exchange, right? And in the process, he will definitely make a profit of 5 cents per share, right? That's the very, very crude example of what an arbitrage opportunity is. Now, in ideal situations, no such arbitrage should ideally exist and both the prices should ideally be the same, right? But there are definitely opportunities that exist in market because of some kind of inefficiencies that could be there within systems and across systems, and that is why arbitrage opportunities present themselves, right? But the point is, with the level of interconnectivity that is there between the global markets right now, every time such kind of an arbitrage opportunity exists, then it will become nullified within no time. That's the whole idea. So in case of a perfect market scenario, arbitrage opportunities should not really exist, right? But there are players who develop significantly complex algorithms, right, to identify such kind of arbitrage opportunities and are able to find them also, right? So that is what is the arbitrage, and the person who is basically looking at doing arbitrage is basically known as a arbitrager. Okay, so that's the fundamental difference between these three. Hope this is very clear. So someone who's trying to protect their fundamental basic interests are basically looking at hedging. That's the idea. In this case, since we're talking about transferring the price risk, essentially that's what is happening in terms of pure play hedging. So that's the answer in this particular case. Okay, let's move on to the next question. What does it say? Now, which of the following is generally not traded off the exchange? Now, when I say off the exchange, there are two terms that you should be aware of. One is, of course, your term called as exchange traded, and the other term that you should be aware is OTC, or over the counter. Now, what this means is that exchange traded will be instruments which will be highly structured, right? And there will not be too much scope for experimentation, which means you cannot change things too much in these kind of instruments. Guys, when I talk about over the counter, it is basically talking about instruments wherein you can definitely experiment and change various elements of the underlying and the terms of the contract. So it can be highly unstructured, and it basically boils down to the two counterparties who are interacting with each other, right? So one of the important things that you need to understand is when I talk about exchange traded, this obviously offers you the protection of the exchange. The OTC obviously offers you significant amount of flexibility in terms of how you want to structure your instrument. But at the same time, because you're dependent on the other counterparty to deliver or pay, there is a significant amount of risk that would be present in the case of over-the-counter instruments. So when I say off the exchange, it means exchange per nahi ho raha hai. That's what it means. It's not happening on the exchange, which means it's not exchange traded, which means it is over-the-counter. Now, which of the following is generally not traded? Always be careful about these kind of negations, as they call in English, whenever you're looking at your questions. So if such negations exist, then you ought to be careful about answering, right? Forwards can be highly customized and tailor-made derivative instruments, and same is the case with your swaps as well. So essentially, when I talk about a forward contract, it is basically a customized contract between two parties, right? So it's highly customized in that sense, and it is between two parties to either buy or sell any asset. Okay, and this obviously would happen at a specified price which is pre-agreed today, and that buy or sell will basically happen at a future date. That's the context. Now, because it is highly non-standardized, in that sense, it is predominantly used for hedging because there might be several use cases that can be derived out of it, right? And now, futures is basically the more structured approach towards forwards. That's the fundamental difference. Now, if you want to understand swaps, then basically when I talk about swaps, so these are your derivative contracts, again, between two counterparties, when they would look at essentially exchanging the cash flows, okay, or let's say liabilities from two different financial instruments, right? So each of those financial instruments would basically be providing one type of a cash flow, and the other instrument would be providing another kind of a cash flow. And based on my risk potential or risk appetite, I may be comfortable with one kind of cash flow and not the other. For example, we talk about a fixed versus floating, right? So while I am constantly playing in the market, I might be more comfortable with a floating rate, but someone who's more risk averse would want a fixed rate of interest coming in, right? So in that case, they can basically get into an interest rate swap. That's the simple layman example that I can give in this case. So again, depending on the structure involved, swaps can also be highly customized, right? So in that context, the option which basically fits the bill here is futures, because they are exchange traded and because they are highly standardized. So that becomes our answer in this particular case. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This is one of the questions that have appeared in the exam before. So it basically says that a person is entering into two trades. Talking about the first trade, in which he basically buys the stock at 400 spot price and sells the stock at 440. So he bought at 400 and he sold at 440. How much did he make? He made 40 on the trade. Now the second scenario, what happens is that he buys futures at 400. So what's happening in this case is that he's basically buying futures, but instead of spending the initial amount, he's only spending a portion of the amount that's required to be spent. So when I talk about derivatives, there is something called as an initial margin, right? So this is basically one of the two types of collaterals, or in a way, when I say collateral, it's like कुछ चीज आप गिरवी रखते हो ना, or let's say you pledge something in order to ensure that you guarantee that the trade or the transaction will particularly happen. Or let's say in terms of a bank, when they're giving you a loan, then basically many a times, let's say assuming that it's a housing loan, you'll basically keep the house itself with the bank as a collateral. So in case you're not able to pay off your EMIs on time, or let's say you continuously default, then essentially since the house is available with the bank as a collateral, they can basically look to derive value from that house as an asset and settle off that or square off that particular loan. So that is what a collateral means. Okay. So similarly, in a derivative, you basically have to maintain that initial margin, which is like a collateral, which is required to protect any party to a contract in the event there is a default by the other counterparty, right? The second margin is basically your variation margin, right? Now that is basically paid daily from one side of the trade to the other side of the trade. Okay, so let's say you have a buyer as well as seller. So then one of the counterparties will end up paying to the other party depending on what is the current market value of that particular trade. कि उस वक्त क्या सिनारियो है, उसके हिसाब से एक वेरिएशन मार्जिन जो है वो दिन का पे अप होता रहता है. So there is a variation margin that gets paid on a daily basis, which basically talks about the current market value. So I'm just talking in very generic terms right now. So these are two kinds of margins that are there. Right. So in this case, when you're talking about that person buying futures at 400 at just 20% margin money, it means that instead of shelling out the entire 400, he's basically using only 20% of the amount, which is 80. Right. So his initial investment is 80, and let's say he sells the same at 440. At the time he's selling it, so essentially it is 440, but the actual value to start off initially was 400. So as a result, his net profit out of this would become 40. So he's able to make 40 on a base of 400 in the first case, and he's able to make 40 on a base of 80 in the second case, which means in the first case, he's made a profit of 10%. In the second case, he's basically made a profit of 50%, right? And that becomes a answer in this particular case. Okay, fairly straightforward question, but an important concept for you to understand here is basically what exactly are margins, right? Okay, let's move on to the next one. What does it say? It's a fairly straightforward one. We've done this just now, so I want you to answer this question yourself. Both the terms are given here to just confuse you, right? So what is the name given to a standardized? It says forward contract, right? To buy and sell at a predetermined rate in the future. So the term future is also given, forward is also given, but the clue for you is it says standardized, right? Now, out of the given options, when I look at contracts, right, it's obvious that you're talking about hedgers and speculators. These are not contracts. These are types of traders or market participants that could be there. So since these are not contracts, they automatically get eliminated. Now you're left with obviously the fundamental three derivatives instruments. Now out of these, you're obviously aware that both your forwards and your swaps are more customized trades, right? So as a result, the answer in this case, either by elimination or by your knowledge, will become futures, which is your standardized forward contract, and that's the answer in this case. Okay, let's move on to the next one now. What does it say? Now it's asking what is the name given to a private agreement between two parties wherein the buyer has an obligation to purchase the asset at a future period. Now, when I say the buyer has an obligation to purchase the asset, obligation का मतलब क्या होता है? You have to do it. You cannot shy away from doing it. Now, understand one fundamental difference between the typical derivatives versus options. Now, what options say is that the terminology itself talks about right, but not an obligation. Right? That's the fundamental difference between a basic derivative like futures, forwards, and swaps versus an option, which gives you nothing but an option. Right? It gives you a right, but it's not an obligation. In all the other cases, it's an obligation, which means that you have to deliver, you have to pay, you cannot let go of it. That's the basic idea. Now, where's the clue here? It basically says a private agreement. So obviously, if it's a private agreement, it's going to be highly customized, right? And it's between two parties. There is no exchange involved as such over here, right? No stock exchange, nothing involved, right? And there is a very clear obligation to purchase the asset at a future period. So in this case, since there is no exchange of cash flows, this option gets eliminated. Since we are not talking about market participants, these two options also get eliminated. And since we're talking about a private agreement between two parties, the answer becomes forwards and not futures, right? Great. So that's the answer in this case. Now let's move on to the next question. What does it say? Which of the following is not a derivative, right? So the basic ones you've already seen: forwards, futures, options, and obviously there is one term here which says credit default swap, and there is something called as a credit agreement, right? So a credit agreement is basically some kind of a underlying. Now, if you're a highly experienced market player, you may or possibly can think of deriving or creating some kind of a structured derivative instrument on top of this. But credit agreement in itself is not a derivative instrument. Now, the next question that comes to your mind is, what is a credit default swap? Right? Now, a credit default swap is nothing but a sort of a financial contract wherein, let's say, the buyer of that particular underlying instrument, which will be obviously in the form of, let's say, credit or some kind of a debt, right? That's the underlying in this case. And that particular buyer is trying to eliminate the possible loss arising because of any kind of a default that may happen in case the person to whom they have lent tends to default. Now, this could also be very easily be a bond. So let's say if I'm talking about a bond, obviously the issuer of the bond is the one who's basically issuing the security and gets money in return. Now, what if the issuer of the bond defaults? What happens to the bondholders? They will lose their money, right? So protecting the interests of the bondholders, or let's say debt holders, is, let's say, one of the ways in which this particular swap works, right? Now, how is this working? This is basically achieved by the, let's say, in this case, the issuer of the bonds ensuring the buyer's potential losses as part of the agreement itself. So this is a very structured kind of a derivative instrument that exists, right? And one of the types of swaps that are there, right? So in this case, obviously, this is also a type of derivative instrument, and credit agreement is the one which is not, right? So that brings us to the answer, which is credit agreement in this case. Now let's move on to the next question. What does it say? Which of the following risks can be eliminated by derivatives? So let's try and understand these risks in the context of derivatives. So firstly, when I talk about systemic risk, this is basically talking about the risk that exists in the system, right? Let's say, for example, that in the event that at a company level mishap or a company level issue can actually lead to a significant instability or collapse of the entire industry or the entire sector, right? That basically becomes a systemic risk, right? So it can basically start from a company and then move and start impacting the industry or the sector and eventually start impacting the economy itself, right? Such kind of a risk is basically known as your systemic risk, right? And obviously it's like basically saying that one thing is linked to the other, and that's why it's called systemic, which means एक चीज होगी उससे दूसरी चीज होगी उससे तीसरी चीज होगी and so on, and the entire group can get impacted. That is what is systemic risk. Now when I talk about systematic risk, it is basically sometimes also referred to as market risk, wherein you're saying that this is the risk that is inherent with the entire market. ये market में पूरा risk है, right? Rather than a particular stock or an industry, and this is something which is already there, and there is no way to diversify this particular risk, right? That is what is known as a systematic risk, right? And similarly, when I talk about market risk, so basically a risk of the losses on your financial investments, which may be caused due to adverse price movements, right? Now, what could be possible example of market risks, right? So let's say, for example, you say changes in the equity prices or the commodity prices, interest rate movements, foreign exchange fluctuations. So all these are basically your market risks, right? Now, when I talk about sovereign risk, it basically talks about the risk or the chance that a national government cut national government's treasury, or let's say a national government's central bank. So it could be any country basically, right? And we're saying that the national government's treasury or the central bank will basically default in any of their sovereign debt. So sovereign basically refers to a country level debt. So if they basically default on their debt, or they look at implementing some kind of foreign exchange regulations or rules or restrictions that will significantly reduce or negate the worth of their foreign exchange contracts. मतलब या तो ऐसा कुछ कर रहे हैं wherein they are defaulting on their country level debt, या तो अपने country level debt पे default कर रहे हैं, या फिर they are making such kind of rules and regulations which basically makes their foreign exchange contracts reduced in terms of value or completely negate the worth of such contracts. Right? For example, you talk about the devaluation of the Chinese currency. That's probably one example that you can look at. So that basically talks about the sovereign risk that is associated. right? Similarly, when I talk about an interest rate risk, it is basically the potential for an investment to lose its value, right, as a result of any kind of interest rate changes, right? So let's say if the interest rates go up, the value of, let's say, your bonds or other fixed income investments would actually go down, because you're aware that, let's say, changes in the interest rates are inversely proportional to the change in the bond price. So that's an example, right? So interest rate movements are in turn affecting the value of the investments, right? And this is one kind of a risk which can basically be protected using derivative instruments, right? So that is what is the answer in this case. All the others are probably risks that can not be mitigated or will not diversify as such. So while there is a possibility that you could probably structure some kind of derivative instruments which can eliminate, let's say, some portions of the sovereign risk, but the question here very clearly states that which of the following risks can be eliminated using derivatives, which means significantly taking care of such kind of a risk, and that basically is possible only for interest rates, and that becomes our answer in this particular case. Okay, let's move on to the next question then. What does it say? This is the only question that we'll be discussing in terms of options here, and this is again purely because it's appeared in all the papers in the past. But one of the things that I want to highlight is, if you understand this fundamental question, if there are any other questions that may appear in terms of options, you'll still be able to answer them, right? So let's basically look at what is an option, right? So option basically talks about a right, but not an obligation to buy or sell an underlying asset, again at a future date at a pre-agreed price, right? So when I talk about the basic options, one is your call option and second is your put option, right? So when I say call option, it's basically a financial contract that gives the option to the buyer of the call option, the right, but not the obligation to buy either a stock or a bond or a commodity or any other asset or instrument at a specified price within a specific time period. So what happens in that case is that, let's say you're expecting the price of, let's consider one of the latest ones into the market, we're talking about Burger King, right? So let's expect this price to actually go up. So let's assume that it's currently trading at around 165 per share. Okay. Now, as someone who's bullish, I'm thinking that this can basically go up further. So I'm bullish about Burger King, and I say that it's possible for this price to rise even up to 250. So what I'll try and do, because I'm looking at a future date, let's say I'm looking at a future date 3 months down the line, and I'm looking at 250 as the strike price, as it is called, right? Okay. So in case the stock price in 3 months for Burger King does not rise till 250, then I will only tend to lose whatever option premium that I paid in order to buy this call option. Right? So obviously there will be some premium associated with it which you'll have to pay in order to buy this call option. Now the point is, if it goes beyond 250, let's say you paid X as the option premium. So let's say it goes beyond 250 and reaches still 303 months, and that's the time period that you've given yourself. And what happens at that point of time is that the profit that you make from this trade is that obviously you will exercise that right to buy the underlying, which is Burger King, at 250. Right? So what you'll do, that you'll buy at the strike price of 250, and you'll obviously look at selling in the market at 300, thereby netting a profit of 50 during the trade. And obviously you lost X in terms of the option premium, so your net profit in that case becomes 50 minus X. So essentially, where will the break even happen? So if the price goes till 250 plus X, right, and X being the option premium that you've paid off, you will be at a net no profit, no loss, right? So you made a profit of X and you gave X as the option premium. So that's the context in terms of a call option, right? So it gives you the right but not the obligation to buy at a particular pre-agreed price at a future date. That's the context, right? Now, on the other hand, this is true for the call option buyer, what happens to the call option seller, and also known as, let's say, an option writer? He is the person who's writing that particular option, right? So in case of the call option seller, what happens is that the seller obviously will be obligated if the buyer chooses to exercise his right. So the buyer exercises right, the call option seller will have no choice but to sell the Burger King share, whatever is the contract size, at a strike price of 250, even though he will tend to make a loss, right? So in this case, what is the income for the option writer? His income by default will automatically be X. That's the premium that is being paid by the option buyer. So he will stand to gain as long as the stock price does not rise up to the strike price. That's the context. Now think about the exact reversal case. When you're bearish about a particular stock, then you'll end up buying the put option, right? What happens in a put option? So let's say that Burger King is trading at 165 and I'm expecting this price to fall further, and I say that I buy a put option which gives me the right but not an obligation to sell at 100. So what happens in that case? Hypothetically, let's say that the Burger King stock price after 3 months falls to 50. Then essentially you'll be able to pick from the market at 50 and you'll be able to sell at 100, which means you'll make a net of 50. Obviously, you'll again have to pay the option premium that is there, right? But it gives you the right to sell. And when will you exercise this right? When you're bearish about that particular stock or bearish about that underlying. Similarly, when will you exercise the call option? When you're bullish, right? And when you see that there is a positive benefit that is possible in that case, right? So when will you exercise the put option? When the stock price falls below the strike price. Similarly, when will you exercise the call option? When the stock price goes above the strike price, right? So I hope the fundamentals of options are clear. Let's come to this question now. What does it say? What type of option trader has the right to sell the security before maturity? So understand one thing, I'm talking about the right and not the obligation. So I'm definitely not talking about the seller here, right? Because seller is the person who's basically the option writer. So he always has the obligation to do what the buyer tells him to do, right? And buyer tells him to do through the exercise of the option. That's the whole idea, right? So in this case, when I'm saying right to sell the security, it basically becomes put buyer. Don't get confused by the terminology seller over here, right? So when I say put buyer, put is the option which gives the buyer a right to sell, and that's why put buyer in this case becomes the correct answer. Now, if it was the right to buy, then call buyer would have been the correct answer, right? So that's the fundamental basic concept around options. The answer in this case is put buyer. Let's move on to the next question now. Now it says, which of the following statements about futures is true? Fairly straightforward question in this case. We've discussed that futures are your standardized instruments, standardized derivatives, right? And they are traded over the exchange and not over the counter, right? So the option in this case is option number C. Fairly straightforward. Let's move on to the next question. What does it say? Now you're saying that Mr. Balsan Khan took a long forward position. It means it's a bullish position, right? So when I say bullish, the other word that can be used for that is long. And similarly, when I say bearish, the other word that can be used for it is short, right? So Mr. Balsan Khan took a long forward position in a contract with 2,000 shares of Reliance worth 85 per share and 1 year maturity. Now, if after 1 year, the price of Reliance rises to 100 per share. So one thing to note here is it was initially 85, it has gone up to 100, which means there is definitely an increase, which means that if you were bullish or if you were long on that particular stock, then whatever you thought has come true, right? So if whatever you thought has come true, definitely you should make some profit in this process, right? So that is for sure. So it has to be a gain. Now, how much gain will happen? That will be derived by the differential between the future price and the current price. This differential is 15 per share. Multiply the number of shares, it basically is 2,000. That gives me a 30k profit, and that's the answer in this case, right? So the gain for Mr. Malsan Khan at maturity will be rupees 30,000, and that's the answer in this particular case. Right, let's move on to the next question now. What does it say? It says that Bumrah enters into a futures contract with PAMI, right, wherein Bumrah takes a long position in the contract, which means Bumrah is taking the bullish position. Okay, what's happening? The counter position in this contract obviously is the bearish position or a short position. Now, who will take that short position? Now, in this case, it's very clearly mentioned that it is a futures contract. So, it's highly tempting to say that the short position will be taken up by PAMI, right? Obviously, it cannot be Bumrah, that's for sure. It could be PAMI, but the instrument here is a future and not a forward. Had it been a forward, I could have still been okay saying that PAMI will be the counterparty, because forward is a highly customized contract between two counterparties, right? But when I talk about a futures contract, it is basically an exchange traded contract, and because it is exchange traded, every trade that happens on the exchange, the counterparty to that is basically the stock exchange itself, and that's why this becomes the answer. Another option which is tempting is that D says if it is OTC, then stock exchange, else PAMI. Now let's try and decipher this statement. First of all, this itself is incorrect. If it is exchange traded, only then it will be the stock exchange. If it is OTC, it is automatically over the counter, which means it could be PAMI. And in this case, there is no point in talking about it depends, right? So option D is nothing but it depends only, right? It says it depends. If it is OTC, then it is stock exchange. If it is not OTC, then it is PAMI. First of all, that correlation itself is incorrect. So I will say that if it is exchange traded, then it is stock exchange. And if it is OTC, then it would be PAMI. Now, even if that was the option given here, where it says that if OTC, then PAMI, else stock exchange, right? Even if this was the option given here, it will still be incorrect, because when you're talking about a futures contract, it is always traded on the exchange and it is not over the counter. So even if option D had been if OTC then PAMI else stock exchange, even then it would have been wrong, because when you're talking about a futures contract, it is traded on the stock exchange, and that is the final answer. Right, let's move on to the next one now. What does it say? It talks about two companies, Golmol Limited and SAKSA Limited, and it basically says that they entered into a 3-year quarterly payout, which means every quarter there is a payout happening. And what kind of swap is it? It's a interest rate swap. So swapping of a fixed interest rate versus a floating interest rate. Okay. Now it says that in the contract, Golmol is expected to receive MIBOR. So when I say MIBOR, it is nothing but Mumbai Interbank Offer Rate. Right, so this is basically a overnight rate, right? So in general parlance, it is a rate that is constantly changing and evolving on a day-to-day basis, and it is the rate of interest that is basically being charged by a bank on any kind of a short-term loan to another bank, right? So that's why it's called an interbank offer rate, right? That's the idea here. In this case, when I look at it, it says that Golmol is expected to receive MIBOR, which means Golmol is expected to receive the floating rate. Why is it floating? Because MIBOR will keep changing, right? And on a initial amount of 50 crores from SAKSA, and pay a fixed rate of 5% on again the same amount, which is INR 50 crore to SAKSA. Now this is the fundamental interest rate swap that exists, wherein your Golmol will receive a floating rate of interest and it has to pay a fixed rate of interest. That's the fundamental. Now, when will Golmol actually tend to gain from this process? The fixed rate is 5%. Now, anytime when the floating rate is greater than 5%, Golmol will stand to gain, because Golmol will have to pay at 5%, but it will be able to receive at a level which is higher, right? But if the floating rate falls below 5%, then automatically Golmol will tend to lose, because then Golmol will have to pay the differential of 5 minus whatever is the floating rate. Let's say the floating rate was 4%, then the differential of 1% on 50 crore is what Golmol will have to pay for that particular quarter. Now, what's the question here? It says who will be in the money for any given quarter if the interest rate in that quarter was at 7%. So let's first of all understand what is in the money or ITM. Usually this particular terminology is used in the context of options, and there are three terms basically: in the money, at the money, and out of the money. Right? So in the money refers to you making a profit or a gain in the entire trade. Right? At the money basically reflects a no profit, no loss situation, and out of the money reflects a negative or a loss in the entire process. So generally this terminology is used for options, but whenever I'm referring to a profit, I can still call it in the money. When I'm referring to a loss, I can still call it out of the money. So this terminology is something that's good to know, right? So what is it saying? It's saying in the money, which means when will there be a positive outcome, right? Now, first of all, let's try and understand that in the given quarter, it's talking about an interest rate in that quarter was 7%. So when it is talking about interest rate in that quarter, obviously it's understood that it's talking about the floating rate only, because the fixed rate is already fixed at 5%, right? So in that quarter, the floating rate was basically at 7%, which is the MIBOR that's being referred to over here. So the context is, if the floating rate was 7%, and we know that Golmol is expected to receive at 7% and has to pay at 5%. So obviously Golmol has to be the one which is making the profit here. So automatically Golmol will be in the money. So these are the two options that come to the picture. The next question that is being asked is, Aise Kaise makes the payment at the start of the quarter and at the end of the quarter. Now what's the problem in this particular scenario? Now when I talk about start of the quarter, I'm not really aware of what could be the possible fluctuations in the interest rate throughout the quarter, right? So how can I make a payment at the beginning of the quarter? So the payment obviously has to be made at the end of that quarter when I have data which tells me what was the indicative floating rate throughout that quarter. So that's the context, and that's why your payment will happen at the end of the quarter, right? So option D is the one which fits the bill, wherein Golmol basically will be getting a differential cash flow. What will be the value of that cash flow? The cash flow will be INR 50 crores multiplied by the differential in terms of 7 minus 5% and the duration of 1 quarter. That's the idea. So the answer in this case comes out to be option D. Okay, let's move on to the next question within the same context. What does it say? Now within this itself, if I talk about the amount of INR 50 crore that is being highlighted in the question, what is this amount of 50 crore, right? Technically, we know that it is obviously known as your principal amount, right? So you talk about any kind of a loan, then you have a principal and an interest component, right? The only fundamental difference as far as a swap is concerned is that in swaps, the principal is called as a notional principal. Why is it called notional? Because it is there for the sake of it. There is no actual exchange of principal that's happening, right? So what happens in this case is that if you look at the example, the 50 crore itself is not getting exchanged between any of these counterparties, right? It's only the differential of the interest, right? So as a result, it becomes a notional principal and not an actual principal, right? That's the fundamental difference between the other terms. There's nothing called as an exchange principal. Maturity amount, again, is not something which is actually getting paid out as part of this contract, so that doesn't fit. Again, swap principal does not make any sense, and none of the above is also not fit in. So obviously notional principal becomes our correct answer in this case. Okay, let's move on to the next question now. What does it say? Now, within the same context, it says if the counterparty who's expected to pay, so for example in this case it was Aise Kaise who had to pay the differential between the 7 and 5%. Now what happens if Aise Kaise defaults? Then who will be taking up the responsibility to pay the other party involved, which in this case is Golmol, in the swap? What happens then? So you talk about the defaulting counterparty's bank. So here in this case, I don't necessarily know what was the overall agreement between the two counterparties. So it's very difficult for me to say that the counterparty's bank will be responsible unless it is explicitly mentioned in the contract that in case of a default, the counterparty's bank takes care of it. Because swaps can be highly structured, customized agreements, there is a possibility. But since it's not explicitly mentioned over here, this option is not possible. Since these are not exchange traded, there is no question of your clearinghouse getting involved over here. Again, underwriters are the ones who are basically, when you talk about your IPOs, they act as your protectors, right? So they basically guarantee that the IPO can happen smoothly. So underwriters are someone who are definitely helping in terms of guaranteeing a particular transaction to take place. But again, the question does not specifically mention about any underwriters in this case, right? That if one party defaults, then the underwriter will come into the picture. Again, it's not very clear. When I talk about FEDI, it is basically the Foreign Exchange Dealers Association of India. So don't get confused. There's a D present over here, so that D will be linked to derivatives. No, it is basically the Foreign Exchange Dealers Association of India. It has got nothing to do with this entire process. So obviously, this also cannot be my answer. So from the given options and from the information given in the question, the answer has to be none of the above, because it doesn't necessarily talk about underwriters, nor does it talk about the defaulting counterparty's bank being liable to pay. Right? So since it's not explicitly mentioned in the question, I cannot assume that to be my answer. Therefore, the answer in this case will become none of the above. Okay, let's move on to the final question for the day. Same question, same context. What does it say here? It says during the tenure of the contract, how many payouts are expected to happen? Now, it's a 3-year contract. That's the tenure of the contract. And it's a quarterly payout contract as well. And very clearly mentions that your floating rate was never equal to the fixed rate, which means that if the floating rate was equal to the fixed rate, there won't be any differential, right? If there is no differential, then there's technically no payout in that quarter. And how many quarters will be there? In 1 year, obviously, you have 4 quarters. So in 3 years, the number of quarters will be 12. And because the floating rate was never equal to the fixed rate, it means that 12 payouts should have ideally happened during that particular cycle. And that becomes our answer in this particular case. So with that, we come to an end to this particular session on finance and more specifically on derivatives. I hope the questions discussed would have helped you understand the basics and fundamentals around derivatives, and it will help you solve a lot of additional questions as well when you try and approach those questions. I look forward to seeing you in the next session with some more interesting set of questions and using those questions to understand and build our concepts further. So until the next session, have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful weekend ahead. Work hard, keep preparing hard, focus and determination will ensure that success eventually will be yours. So on that note, see you guys.